I'm Jim Tynan from Morgan Lewis here in our New York office, as Bill said, in the energy and infrastructure space, and have been very active in this market. And one of the things, and I'm very happy that to be here today, and for Morgan Lewis to be a partner with Our Energy Policy, because as a global law firm, we're representing pretty much everybody in the energy sector, and of course in New York. Energy means electric power, but for a lot of the country, energy covers oil and gas, and we're crossing over more with gas, and we're starting to talk about nuclear as being, another renaissance. The 3.0 is what we're hearing about in some of our clients. But so very happy to be here. Bill asked me just to kind of set the stage for a minute. And one of the things that we are seeing as 2026 gets started are a couple of pretty dramatic things. There's a lot of things that are happening this year that are the same as 2025, but as we probably all know, 23, 24, 25 were 25 was very, very different than 23 and 24. So what our clients are doing, our independent power producer clients are kind of whipsawed and trying to do two things at once. We're seeing in the market today, the independent power producers across the field with various technologies are rushing to try to finish all their current inventory and get construction started, get financing lined up, get offtakes arranged all over the country as they face the new changes in tax credits and policy and domestic content requirements, and basically changing their whole business model on the fly as they're reacting to supply chain costs and challenges with planning. At the same time, these are entrepreneurs, and therefore they're being very optimistic and setting themselves up for the long-term planning. And that's a challenge for advisors because we're trying to help them figure out where they should be placing the 5-year bets because they have things on their plate today for the first couple of years. We also represent a lot of regulated utilities, and the regulated utilities, as we know, have a duty to serve. They are facing unprecedented demand for power and interconnection rights all across the country. And so we're seeing utilities change their business model. They're looking to get back into the generation business, and we're dealing with a lot of those challenges, both on the technology, equipment supply, regulatory, permitting, interconnection. And so we're involved in a lot of joint ventures and financial structures for regulated utilities that they have not been involved with for 25 years. So that's a challenge for the market that we're all seeing. Obviously, we're dealing with policy changes and challenges at the state level, the federal level. New York has been a leader for decades, and I think this really sets the stage for this conversation today. I think Bill's going to tell us a little bit about our speakers in a minute, but as we know, with Doreen Harris as the president and CEO of NYSERDA, NYSERDA has been taking a leading position for the past 50 years. As we know, last year they celebrated a big anniversary, and it's very important to recognize that 50 years ago, Governor Hugh Carey helped put together the NYSERDA and with the state legislature to create a state agency independent of the regulatory scheme to promote energy resilience and research and job growth. And Doreen will tell us more about that. And Andrew Shapiro will hear about more for his Broadscale Group, has been a catalyst and in the cross-section of public policy and private investment in innovative technologies involving the whole climate change menu for 25 years. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and we'll talk afterwards. Thanks a lot, Bill.
All right, so as Jim said, NYSERDA celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. I don't remember that, of course. It was way, way, way before my time, but I'm sure it was a great moment when Governor Carey started that. In any event, I'm now going to turn it over to our speakers. I do want to encourage everyone to note questions. We'll leave some time at the end for questions from all of you from the audience. Jim mentioned the leadership of New York State. As some of you know, Doreen Harris has been leading NYSERDA for 6 years. Part of the reason New York is looked to all over the country for leadership in this space is Doreen. She's a visionary. She's been a strong and very powerful leader of NYSERDA and someone who really has the best interests of the state at heart. And we're going to hear from her about the plan for 2026, and Andrew Shapiro, who has many, many years as a leader, a thought leader in innovation, sustainable technology, all kinds of innovation, and has helped to advise numerous companies, is on the board of 25 startups and advises C-suite companies. So we have a great group to lead this conversation, and thank you once again, Doreen, Andrew.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Doreen. Really great to have you with us today. Before we jump into the formal questions, one thing I'm just going to mention that another affiliation is I'm founding board member of the Clean Fight, which NYSERDA funded, so we'll just get that out there. I was thinking the following. How many people here have been watching Landman? Anybody? It's a very compelling show. But I keep watching, I keep thinking when I'm watching, like, what would Landman for clean energy look like? Why can't someone make that TV show? So all of you talk amongst yourselves, think about that. We'll get that TV show produced very soon. All right. Doreen, let's start with kind of the brass tacks. We're living in a very interesting time for energy generally, and specifically energy transition. People ask me, what's going on? I say it's like the old, best of times, worst of times. I mean, we have, let's be frank, real challenges from the federal government in terms of some of the priorities that we've set out here in New York State. So you have to figure those out. At the same time, as the others have alluded to, we are living through a moment that is truly unique in terms of surging power demand and figuring out how to deal with that. And so amidst all of these headwinds, tailwinds, and drivers of innovation, your state energy plan is kind of the crux of what New York is doing on energy, and you just released it in December. Can you talk to us about kind of the key findings and recommendations of those plans? That'll be a great way to get us started.
Wow, the state energy plan is a great way to get us started. I'm impressed. No, it's great to be here, and thank you, Bill, for inviting me again. Last time I spoke with Sadie McCune a few years ago, my water exploded as I was starting. So I'm already like a step ahead as far as I'm concerned. This is going much better. Glad to be here. And I do want to recognize NYSERDA board member Jen Hensley, who's here. Shout out to Jen. Thank you so much for your service. So yes, NYSERDA, as you had heard, I'm still going to ride the 50-year wave. I'm going to keep it going into the coming year. Why not? It worked so well. But ultimately, I think when NYSERDA was formed, I wouldn't want to put myself into Hugh Carey's brain at the time, but obviously the authority that was ultimately formed, i.e. NYSERDA, I think was intended to form a certain purpose, which was to be an objective entity to advance energy technologies that could be fundamentally useful in addressing what at that time had been a very real energy crisis in our state. You see a lot of entities like NYSERDA, although there is nothing quite like NYSERDA, were formed around that same time, and it's for much the same reason that we're dealing with today. So NYSERDA is just full of people who are just experts in whatever their space may be, whether it be technology or finance or policy or planning. It's a very interesting time for people like us to really be at the forefront of these very real issues that you're describing, because in part, most of us are there, like myself, because we're very interested in energy systems, energy technologies. I'm an engineer by training. Ultimately, energy has been thrust into an ecosystem that was very much not like the past number of decades. And that's very much part of why we really went about last year's state energy plan in the manner that we did, because as objective energy planners, we felt it was quite important to level set around what New York's energy future can reasonably be, and frankly, to impart objectivity and facts into a world that has really gotten quite confused around energy issues writ large. And I'm happy to talk about some places where I think it does get a little bit mixed up. But the energy plan was finalized after over a year's worth of work at the end of last year. And I think for the state of New York, it provides a very solid foundation. And certainly the governor set forward a number of objectives that we were solving for in completing the plan. And anyone who has listened to her recently, or even in the past year or two, she's very, very aware of energy issues because of the fact that it's prominent, right? It's a prominent issue across our state and frankly across the country. So the energy plan, NYSERDA is the state's energy office. Our job was to look at the energy future of our state forward 15 years and to begin to chart a path toward its achievement. And I think it has been notable because this was the first real energy plan that had occurred in almost a decade, in part because in the interim period, we had the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed, CLCPA, in 2019. And the work of the Climate Action Council really, I would say, took over what would have probably otherwise been an energy plan update, a formal energy plan update in that time frame. And so part of our job as an energy planner was to really solve for multiple variables. And those variables, the governor really made clear that she says this, she wants an affordable energy system. She wants a reliable energy system. She wants a resilient energy system. And she wants a clean energy system. And I think in the mix of all of this, what the energy plan represents is a level of ambition that is achievable, but that balances multiple variables in a way that is very clear-eyed around the challenges that we face in the near term, but I think the very real progress that we're making in energy deployment in the, also in the near term. So the plan lays out the reality. So this is all energy sources. Remember, energy systems are not just electricity, right? These are all the fuels that we use across our state in a variety of ways, and ultimately saying the fact that we see increased reliance on energy systems in those coming 15 years. Certainly from an electricity perspective, we see load growth on the order of 24-25% in that planning horizon. But it also is the case that we as a state will benefit greatly from a diverse set of resources so as to meet those needs, those energy needs. And for the state, this is really important to lay out in a very factual way what we believe is ambitious but achievable from an energy perspective and the deployment of clean energy resources across our state, but also being clear-eyed about the fact that we will need to continue to rely on the energy systems that we have in that same planning period. So that means, yes, that the fossil assets are going to need to be maintained. In some instances, and we looked very carefully at various regions of our state, there may be repowering and or new generation needed to be added in that time frame as well. And so the plan, I think, presents a view that perhaps many of us in this room would want to be a different view, but it is an objective view at what can actually happen in that time frame and the needs to balance, or the ability to balance all of those objectives. So that's a long-winded way of saying.
Can I jump in with one little question there?
Yes.
Since you hinted at it, perhaps. Do you think the plan came out in a different place in any way than it would have if we'd had a different president?
Oh, certainly. Certainly. The federal headwinds that we have faced literally in the past year, well, a little over a year now, are truly unprecedented. And they will have knock-on effects on the clean energy industry that unfortunately are not just today issues. They're going to go on for a number of years. And one thing NYSERDA is fighting like hell to do is to minimize the damage that will occur. But there definitely is a slowdown in the deployment of these technologies based on the literal assault that has occurred, whether that be tax credit rollbacks, whether that be litigation, whether that be stop work orders, et cetera, when we are looking at the near term, we have extraordinary progress that I really want to reflect on today, but it is definitely impacting us in the near and perhaps midterm. But I think it is important to note that in the long term, all those fundamentals still exist, and very much that is what we're driving toward, is that mid to longer term transition that we know is possible, but needs to be informed by the reality of the day.
Then let's talk about climate. You mentioned the CLCPA, passed in 2019, very ambitious. A lot's happened since then. What are the state's plans for implementing it, and do you think there need to be any changes made for the same reasons we just discussed?
Yes, so I had the pleasure of co-chairing the Climate Action Council with the then DEC Commissioner Sagos, and our job was to lay out the pathways whereby the Climate Act could be achieved. And I think through that work, we certainly laid out through the scoping plan the pathways that would get us from here to there. In doing so, even upon the first modeling runs that we produced, we really began to internalize, right, the level of transformation that would be necessary to achieve those Climate Act goals. When you say, oh, we're going to move from 9% EV sales to 90% EV sales in less than a decade, and we're going to do the same with heat pumps, and we're going to, double our grid's capacity, et cetera, like, that was our job, and that was very much, I think, that is valuable in and of itself, because it establishes a level of ambition upon which to solve. And that is why we have such important, not only goals on the books, but also pathways to achieve them. It sets a level of ambition against which to strive. But it also really noted, even in the executive summary, how disruptive that level of transformation would be to achieve. And so I think in the very beginning, we knew that this was a tall order. In fact, we had said very clearly, this is the hardest thing we will ever do collectively as a state. So it was already challenging, no doubt. The near-term challenges faced by the federal government have really placed us in a position where one of the main conclusions of the state energy plan is that under the current accounting framework that we utilize, our near-term goals are likely to be achieved in 7 or 8 years past the date that at least is part of the Climate Act. So we say this because, of course, we can't bury our head in the sand about the realities that we're facing, but we also need to be planning for those outcomes so as to really advance the economic impacts that energy policy can and will have. And I think that's really the central change that I have seen in the 15 years I have been at NYSERDA, is the ways in which our energy system, our energy policy, becomes our economic policy. Like, those two things go hand in hand, and we really do need to be solving for all of those things at the same time. So the long and short of it is there are aspects of the Climate Act that are infeasible at this point, but they are feasible in the longer term. And there's various aspects of the Climate Act that, at least in our view, if changed, could really create more, I'd say, ability to get from here to there at the same time.
And so do you think that there will be changes made to the plan, or it's just that targets won't be met? I mean, it's kind of like, I deal with startups all the time. They miss their numbers all the time. So you do reforecasts.
Well, certainly I can't speak to whatever legislative strategy might be underway. But what I will say is, at least from the perspective of the energy plan, we were very clear about when we believe these goals can be achieved. I want to be clear, it's the near-term goals that are really at odds with the realities of the time. But it also was clear about some of the realities that the Climate Act creates for us. One of the things I've talked a lot about, which is as nerdy as it gets, is the accounting rules that are part of our Climate Act. There's 3 different components of New York's accounting, and really they create a world in which New York is measured by a very different standard than the rest of, frankly, the country and the world. And I think that creates not only a view that Climate Act or that climate action is a failure in some ways, but also a world in which we have fewer resources upon which to rely. Things like renewable fuels, et cetera, are those that are really placed at an extreme disadvantage according to New York's accounting framework. And therefore, a lot of the technology, the world of technology, would yield resources that are tough for New York to rely on that other markets may be able to utilize. So I don't take a position on amendment to the CLCPA, but I did certainly through the State Energy Plan lay out some of the challenges that the Climate Act creates because of its design.
We talked a little bit about the feds. I want to talk about the city in a moment, but what about other states? So, because you referenced even, hey, and I've always loved this idea that, states are the laboratories of policy innovation and so forth. Do you find yourself talking more to other states to say, how are you guys handling these challenges?
Oh, certainly. The states have sort of gotten over any parochialism that may have existed back in the heyday, and ultimately we're all in the same boat, right? Particularly the New England or the East Coast states, right? We have a lot of parallelism with respect to the challenges that we're facing. And I think the ways in which we're really thinking about getting ourselves on solid footing with respect to the near-term issues. Look, I mean, it's never been the case that New York could ever do this alone. Like, we wouldn't presuppose that it could. I think New York is relevant, very relevant in that context of what is happening beyond our borders. Like, we need a movement that exists beyond our borders to get from here to there. And it is therefore relevant that we all stand behind the progress that we're making and the imperative of keeping this momentum as strong as we possibly can. So that a good example, in all likelihood, would be the ways in which we've all responded, obviously, on the offshore wind front. I know we've got some offshore wind friends in the room. Obviously, the litigation that has been underway is a way in which we're all coming together around saying that we need these projects, we need their benefits, and we need their electrons sooner than later, please. But also the ways in which we hope some of our activities can help keep this industry moving. In fact, just yesterday, we announced an RFI that NYSERDA has issued to really try to make some investments to keep pre-development activities for these projects moving, even in light of the obvious near-term federal challenges that we're facing. So we continue. I mean, these are states that have worked together for decades. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a great example of the ways in which we're doing more together, and I only think that will continue to grow.
Great. Okay, let's talk about the city. The new mayor's agenda on energy and climate is still, I would say, unfolding. Some of the personnel are still, coming together. But we know there are certain ambitious goals around things like Local Law 97. Yeah. So what is NYSERDA doing to assist? Let's talk about that to start, and then anything else you want to reflect on about where the city's going. But Local Law 97, as folks know, is about reducing emissions from commercial real estate. And, some building owners have expressed the view that it's hard for them to meet the objectives. And I know NYSERDA has been in there trying to help. Tell us a little more about that.
Sure, yeah. This is another example of why it's so great to work in a state like New York, because we have a city like New York City that can serve in a very critical capacity of really spurring the activities that we are pushing statewide. And of course, I'm well aware of the mayor from his prior role in the assembly, and ultimately, we'll see, what their policy ultimately extends to from the climate and energy perspective. But as it exists today, look, there's great synergies. We have ways in which, Local Law 97 stands on its own, obviously, but where we can contribute really has to do with the various programs that NYSERDA can bring to bear to help these buildings reach toward those objectives within Local Law 97. So as an example, NYSERDA has myriad programs in the building space. Our Flex Tech program is probably the best example of ways in which we can really get into these buildings and help them begin their journey through not only emissions reduction, but energy efficiency and ultimate electrification as well. I think, is quite relevant that we are doing a lot of work to decarbonize the New York City grid, as it were, both by virtue of the offshore wind projects that I had mentioned, the distributed solar projects that are being installed, and storage projects across the city. But also, I have to give my other shout out to the Champlain Hudson Express project, which is a huge game changer, right, for the city, and it'll be coming online in just a few months, together with offshore wind. I mean, we're talking about upwards of 20 to 30% of New York's electricity will be via these renewable resources. So that all matters with respect to the accounting toward those goals. And I think that is the ways in which we as a state can be useful in facilitating, frankly, one of the biggest challenges we have, which is the built environment. The emissions, as we all know, are predominantly from buildings in New York's economy, unlike many where transportation would be leading. We have a very efficient transportation system, as it were, and an electrified one at that in the city. But the buildings are really one of the biggest challenges we face. So that's why we're there, with these types of programs and with the utilities at the same time.
Great. Let's talk about nuclear, one of the always interesting and hot button issues in energy. NYSERDA has announced, I think you said, a few different initiatives, so it would be great to unpack those. And I think the governor just in the last week or two announced an effort to build up to 4 gigawatts worth of new reactors in the state, plus the 1 gigawatt she asked NYPA to build. So are we on the verge of a nuclear renaissance in New York State?
Well, I started my career in a nuclear power plant, so this is all very exciting for me. Very, very exciting. But I think there are a few components of this. And in some ways, I think the governor's commitment to nuclear tracks to her commitment to offshore wind. There's a lot of fundamentals that are somewhat similar in that, in all instances, these are long-lived assets, right? They're long-term. This is long-term planning. No one is pretending there's a nuclear power plant that will be installed in New York in 5 or maybe even 10 years. But when we look at the future, again, back to the state energy plan, we are going to need many gigawatts of what I call clean, firm resources. And nuclear is a great example of a clean, firm resource. And in fact, when we looked at the state energy plan out to 2050, we modeled that 5 gigawatts of nuclear in that out year. And I am here to tell you a nuclear future is also a renewable future, because in concert with that 5 gigawatts of nuclear, we needed upwards of 50 gigawatts of renewables. The facts on the ground would say we need all of it. Basically, as I said, we need electrons. So for those reasons, I'm really excited to execute not only on the activities that the governor had previously directed us to do, which was in the first instance a nuclear master plan, not all that different than our offshore wind master plan, really looking at the broader ecosystem and technologies and readiness of various applications for nuclear. But then she gave that, obviously, a big shot in the arm by directing NYPA to I would say, advance the very first project for New York State. And then, as you said, just a couple of weeks ago, announced another 4 gigawatts that really allow us, I think, to do a couple of things. Number one, as I said earlier, goals are sometimes a blessing and sometimes a curse, right? But I consider goals to be useful to just at least say this is what we're solving for. And the fact that New York is pursuing a 5 gigawatt number puts us in a very different planning posture than if we were pursuing a 1 gigawatt number. And so the master plan can definitely be advanced with this in mind, but I think importantly, we also really need to look at the ways in which the fundamental points are what are the policy levers that are needed to actually achieve this. And building a nuclear power plant is very different than building a solar project or a gas plant or a wind farm. These are, very significant investments for a baseload power, right, that has value over, in the case of New York's operating fleet, many, many decades. So it's going to require a lot of tools to get from here to there, and those tools will necessarily involve the federal government as well. This is one area where we have alignment, certainly with the federal government, is really the ways in which we believe we can be putting not only the investments, but the tools that they have moving forward to realize those outcomes. But again, this is planning for infrastructure that is not going to be installed immediately, but it is necessarily required to get started. So that's what we'll be working on. This is a partnership with NYPA, of course, but also the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, who have been tasked to take up a proceeding around just this topic. So I think it's a huge opportunity space, and it's not just because I started at a nuclear power plant. I think it's important, right? We need to be doing the things today that will benefit us in decades to come. And so that's how I see this goal.
Within that, was there any special attention paid to small modular reactors and even, although they don't like to call it nuclear, fusion?
Yes. So the master plan is really looking at all of these. It has an entire study on fusion. You'll be very excited. But also, it remains to be seen you're right, what specific technologies we are talking about. In fact, I think that's one of the very real benefits of having a 5 gigawatt goal, is that we can be relevant in saying, what are the technologies we're going to standardize around? SMRs are a great example. There are literally dozens of SMR technologies out there and companies out there. One of the things we're doing, as I had mentioned, we do work with other states. We're co-leading a NASIO initiative called the First Movers Initiative, which is intended to say, what does an order book look like? Can we as states come together, and these are, predominantly red states, come together around with respect to technology selection, that proverbial pipeline or order book of technologies that will help us reduce unit costs, but also help the market standardize. So the direct answer to your question is, actually, that question is not answered at this moment, because this is really part of our work, is to say, where do we see applications for different technologies, all the way from a microreactor all the way up to an AP1000. Like, it may not be a universal answer, but this is why the scale matters.
Another area that I think those of us who are doing venture investment in the space are very excited about is, how software and technology can be used to make orchestration of energy more efficient. So virtual power plants and demand response and other things like that, connections obviously into energy storage. How big a priority is that in the state?
I know, this is where I was wishing. I thought Richard Kaufman was coming. I had like the best answer ever for Richard Kaufman, but look, I mean, when we look at the system that we have, we absolutely have to get as much out of that system that we possibly can. And that is true of all energy systems, but particularly our electricity system. And Richard and I talk about this all the time, how underutilized the system we have is. This is in part why we at NYSERDA invest so heavily in innovation, because our technologies that we are advancing through our innovation team, as you're well aware, are in part intended to get after this issue, which is utilization and flexibility and reliability, right? All of those things are part of technology solutions that we invest in as an innovation arm of the state of New York. So yes, innovation is, as I like to say, it's the biggest bang for our buck from an investment perspective at NYSERDA, but it also is the case that there's technologies we're deploying today that are particularly useful in this respect as well. Energy storage is among them. Certainly, we have a 6 gigawatt energy storage goal for the state. We have a number of procurements that we're advancing to realize that goal, but the overall reason for advancing energy storage is for the reasons you're just describing. It's to maximize utilization, it's to provide reliability, and it's to reduce costs. In fact, the estimate was $2 billion of ratepayer savings that we will achieve via that 6 gigawatt goal. And we see that in action already with our distributed solar projects. New York has a very major bright spot with respect to goal achievement on distributed solar, where we reached the Climate Act goal a year early for distributed solar, and now we are seeing the benefits of those resources. Even here in New York City, if you were to ask the New York Independent System Operator, our solar resources were a huge benefit to them, even in this recent cold snap. Solar really came through to reduce peaks and to allow reserves of other fuels to be restored. Even last summer, the number we have quoted is $90 to $100 million in the June peak of 2025 that we saw savings from our storage or solar projects. So all that to say, this is really exciting for me to start seeing these charts. Now, I'm still envious of the charts in California and Texas, not going to lie to you, but like that's our future, right? That's where we see these resources really being relevant from a reliability and affordability perspective as they begin to scale.
So while we're talking flexibility, give us NYSERDA's perspective on the data center boom and what it's going to mean for demand in the state. Maybe not as significant as some other parts of the country like PJM and ERCOT, et cetera, but still there's a lot going on.
Yes, the data center topic is the topic of the year, other than affordability, those two things.
That was my next question.
Yeah. Yeah, so we did. I mean, this is something that, well, in the first instance, back to the state energy plan, this is something that we plan for. I mentioned the 25% load growth over 15 years. Like, in part, that's planning not just for building and transportation electrification, but also, I'd say, the larger loads that we see moving in across our state. Now, New York has the best example of a large load in the case of the Micron facility that is going to be installed near Syracuse. That is electric load. That is New Hampshire and Vermont combined, in case you were wondering how much load will need to be served by that facility alone. However, it also is the case that data centers generally remain relevant in our economy. And I'd say this is one of those topics where we see very rapid movement from a political perspective. New York does have many gigawatts of data centers, at least when one looks at the interconnection queue. The question just becomes how many come to realization. And I will remind you that in New York, load has to pay, right, for the upgrades necessary to meet that load. But it also is the case that the governor has been clear that if you are a data center and you are coming with very few jobs, you also need to come with your own generation. And that's been a priority of hers, as articulated even just this year, just last month. But I'd say this is an area that is rapidly evolving. And I think this is also an area that we at NYSERDA are working on, which is efficiency. We talk about energy efficiency, kind of the things we were talking about in the 70s are very relevant today. And that's efficiency not just for a consumer like you and me, right? How do we reduce those utility bills? But how do we help from a technology perspective to improve the efficiency of data centers? So that's an area of focus for our innovation team as well. So this is a story that's still being written, I would say. As a general matter, we plan for these types of loads, but obviously it is a work in progress with respect to the flexibility and, I'd say, attributes that they come with.
So let's talk about the flip side, which is affordability, right? I heard a great phrase the other day: electricity is the new eggs. Because it's becoming a political focus, it's becoming a concern for, how it's hitting folks in the pocketbook. What's NYSERDA's role there?
Yes. So one of the things that we really do work very hard to make sure that the ways in which the investments that we are making are known from the perspective not only of the ability to meet climate and clean energy goals, but also the ways in which clean energy in and of itself is, in fact, an affordability solution. And I think that is why we spent so much time in the state energy plan really talking about this topic of affordability. In fact, we have a full affordability study that is appended to the state energy plan, because it is the case that we really need to look at this topic from the perspective of each consumer. Because I think it's important for us to know, right? This is a diverse state. And an upstate New Yorker who has 2 cars and a 3,000 square foot house is experiencing energy burdens in a very different way than a city resident, right? Using the MTA and in a building like this. So all that to say, we went through multiple different, what we called customer journeys in the state energy plan, really looking at the ways in which their energy burden would or wouldn't be impacted by adopting clean energy technologies. And I think it's very important to note, as I'll say it again, that clean energy, full stop, really demonstrates the fact that affordability can be achieved by virtue of adoption of these technologies. Let's start with efficiency, okay? In the first instance, NYSERDA has been running efficiency programs for literally decades, and the numbers are now in the billions as relates to how much money efficiency is saving consumers. But it is also the case that electrification of one's home or one's transportation means can also result in affordability solutions. And so for most New Yorkers, they would be seeing monthly savings on their bills, their energy bills writ large, let me be clear, energy of all kinds, if they were to adopt those solutions. But, and importantly, there is an upfront cost, right? There's an upfront cost of that transition. And we're also objectively looking at the ways in which those costs necessarily have to be reduced over time to reduce barriers to entry and to allow more consumers to adopt these technologies at the same time. And so affordability is a very difficult question to really put your finger on what someone is talking about because energy systems are so complex. Another aspect of the energy plan really looked at what the cost of maintaining the system that we have is. $150 billion a year. That's the answer. So the reality
That's
is
the maintenance cost?
to maintain the energy systems across our state of all kinds, right? And to deliver the fuels that we need and the maintenance that's required. The point is the energy plan also concludes that business as usual comes with a cost, right? It costs money to deliver energy systems as a general matter. And that is why, I really do think this pivot of energy from being something other than infrastructure, I think, has been useful for us because we are now talking about energy as a commodity that has more value to people, but also we all need to understand what it takes to really deliver that energy to consumers. And as I'd say a state, this was a question in our budget hearing, it is a blessing and a curse to also be one of the first states to really build out these energy systems at scale because, of course, they are among the oldest in the nation. And so the maintenance of these systems, if you have a pipeline that is 80, 90 years old, it requires maintenance. If you have a power generating unit that is 60 years old, it may need to be repowered. So all of these things are necessarily part of the energy system and the ways in which we are all really paying for that system via the bills that we receive. So this is where we've really at NYSERDA had to necessarily get back to basics around not only understanding of energy systems, but really utilizing the resources that we have, again, the funding we have, to really help consumers save money. And that's why programs like our Empower program are so central to the work that we do, because we are literally helping the lowest income New Yorkers not only make their homes more comfortable, but more energy efficient, reduce their bills, and allow us, obviously, to assist those who need it the most. So there's some things about today's world that are actually quite similar to the 70s in that respect, and I think that's something we should all reflect on.
Specifically, though, on the topic of, and I think you referenced this, that under New York state law, if someone's coming in to build a data center, they have to bring their own capacity?
It's a proposal.
It's a proposal. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because that, I know, is being talked about in a lot of places to kind of shift some of these costs to those who can absorb them. All right. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. So think about your questions and we'll recognize you. But I want to ask you, Doreen, one more question, because this is another area where I think there's opportunity for collaboration across political lines. It seems that the one thing, maybe besides nuclear, that everybody agrees we can do is improve energy permitting and get rid of red tape and move things faster for interconnects and so on. How are you guys involved in that?
Yes, we have. I'm glad you brought up permitting. Let me just bring this to a bit of a different level, but I will answer your question directly. One of the things we're doing right now, as was just reflected when this panel kicked off, was we have this moment in time in which we have the expiration of tax credits that are extraordinarily valuable for New Yorkers, really across the board, whether that be electric vehicles or, well, that already expired, building technologies, and power generation technologies, et cetera. The governor has made clear she wants us to maximize the generation that we can build in the very near term. And so she really put us all in a room and said, figure this out. And because it's a multifaceted challenge. It's one that requires not just private sector to come forward with projects, but yes, the actors who are permitting, who are interconnecting, who are financing, who are in my world, procuring, et cetera. Like that needs to happen because of not only the savings that it can provide, but also really when one looks at it, the projects that New York can rely on to meet this electric load are those that are well along their way already. And what are those? Those are wind projects, those are solar projects, those are storage projects, and a little bit of hydro. Like those are the resources that we will be relying on in the near term, and we will need to be building in the near term to meet those demands. So this requires us in the near term to really build all that we can and to demonstrate that it's possible. And I think kind of building on that, it is also the case that we have various ways in which these projects are permitted. In New York State, we have the Office of Renewable Energy Siting that is responsible for the larger renewable projects and their siting and permitting. That has been underway for a number of years. I think there's a lot of ways in which it has definitely improved the process of permitting for the large projects. From the perspective of more distributed projects, the governor has really included clean energy projects as part of her seeker reform that is part of this year's budget imperative. Of course, housing is getting the sort of primary headline, but within that, our seeker reforms, not just for project developments, but even for entities like NYSERDA, in which we have really work to do to improve our own seeker processes as well. So I think New York generally got a very big head start with the establishment of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting on the ways in which we can expedite and standardize permitting. But I think on a local level, there's some real leadership by the governor to also make sure, right, for communities who want these projects, who really have sites that are well suited for them, that they move along.
Wonderful. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and a reminder that we would like questions, not speeches or statements. So if you devolve into one of those, I will stop you. This gentleman in the back.
Yes, hi, I'm Tom from Andrew.
Oh, hi, Tom.
Good to see you. So my question is about the role that natural gas will play in New York's energy future. And I happen to be sitting next to project developers who are developing a net zero natural gas power plant in, where's your project? Upstate. Where? Oswego? Oswego County. So they would love to know, will there be a role for natural gas if it has a low carbon or net zero result?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start by saying I'll be just if I wasn't clear, one of the things that is frankly a major finding of the state energy plan is the fact that we're going to need to rely on our fossil fuel systems for at least the next 15 years. And so what does that look like for our state? What that looks like is not just the maintenance of the systems that we have, but we have, our estimate was up to 6 gigawatts of capacity that would necessarily require investment, and that means repowering. And what does repowering mean? I mean, that can take a lot of different forms, whether that be at the same site, at a greenfield site, et cetera. The point being, we have, I think, made clear that we will need to be investing in those systems for the coming, as I said, the coming 15 years. And that is the case sort of generally. You've seen the governor obviously make clear that she is willing and has objectively considered the fossil needs of the state. She's made clear she's willing to consider proposals of all sorts, and that actually has been the truth, right, for various investments, including the Nessie pipeline decision that was rendered last year. From the perspective of new infrastructure, though, I do want to be clear that the SEP does not claim to be a utility planning document. We did take a hard look at the needs here in New York City in Zone J, where we see, obviously, reliability reserve margins reducing and the potential needs that may result from those reserve margins. But when we really looked at each utility's planning, there's a wide variety of needs, right? Some would say there's a real need for new generation, and others' plans really don't show that. So specific to Oswego, as an example, the SEP didn't really get into that level of specificity. But what one can say, and what is happening, of course, across our state, is our planning systems are working, right? We've got ways in which The New York Independent System Operator works obviously in concert with the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission and the utilities, right, to really lay out generation needs that may exist across our state. And for those reasons, I think this is why the SEP is a really important foundation, because while it is not a decisional document, it is a document that was drafted by all of those entities, including the PSC chair and the NYSO president, who are members of the Energy Planning Board. Like, this is part of the work that will ensue as we begin to really look more specifically at the regional needs that exist across our state. So we've got work to do, right? It's a foundation, but I wouldn't claim it's the end, right? We've got proceedings and analysis and processes that will build on this.
Great. We'll go to Houston and then Bill.
Yeah, just, I think it was last week or so, there was the article in the Times about the blockade by the Trump administration against, solar renewables, et cetera, that is aside from, the wind, the offshore wind, where the record is, fortunately, not being upheld in the courts. So is that, you see that in New York? How would that affect New York? They talked a lot about federal, sites, but also lots of other sites that might need, let's say, a wetlands permit or some other federal permit. Are you seeing that play out in New York?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the world of challenges, it certainly is the case that offshore wind has really reached the pinnacle, but it is the case also that all renewables have particular challenges. First, as I described, from the sunset of the tax credits that were really central to the build out of this industry, but also for your point, like not all of them can be permitted locally or by the state, right? Some do require federal permits, and it is having implications on project development, maybe a little less so in New York than some other jurisdictions where we just don't have as many public lands in that sense as would, some of the states further to the west. But we do. I mean, we see solar and wind projects finding creative transmission line routes that don't cross certain lands, et cetera. All that has the effect of delay and cost. That's really it. And so that's why I think one of the major our planning scenario for the state energy plan lays out a much more muted view as to the near-term build-out of those resources for that very fact.
Great. Bill?
Yeah, it's very encouraging to hear your views about the role that renewables are playing, and that that nuclear is beginning to have a renaissance. Those are all very positive things. However, at least in my view, in states and even in New York, NIMBYism has not gone away. There is a lot of NIMBYism out there. And so my question is, what, in your thinking about orchestrating the state energy plan, what is it you're going to do to try on, at least, because I think you have to get down to the very local level, to encourage people to support these programs and actually, and whether it's demand response or even supply, because people don't necessarily want something built right behind their store or their, or their house. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's a tough one. Obviously, it is true that we need supportive communities in the first instance, and that's something we at NYSERDA spend an awful lot of time on. We have teams that literally travel the state for that sole purpose, not to necessarily advocate for a particular project or not, but to make sure these communities have the resources they need, right, and the facts they need to chart their own destiny. A great example of that is the energy storage outreach that has been underway. Obviously, energy storage, as I had described, it's so central to the benefits that we can realize as a state, but we need to be able to site it. And energy storage, as it exists today, is all sited locally. So when we had a number of fires across our states in 2023, we got out there, right? We developed a plan that involved not only an assessment of the energy storage systems and technologies, but the ways in which we could both educate the public and produce codes that will literally set a nationwide standard for energy storage safety that others are following. But facts matter, right? And I think that's one of the biggest realities that I face in my day-to-day. I told you I'm an engineer. Facts definitely matter to me. But when one looks at the realities people are facing, it's complicated, right? Energy systems are mattering in ways that people aren't used to paying any attention to. And that is why when we really think about this, it has to be on a very human level that we are working with people, not only because they need to have facts, but also, and I think very importantly, many of these technologies that we're advancing actually improve the quality of life of the consumer. Like your smart thermostat is a great example, right? Like, how awesome is it that you can turn up your heat before you get home, right? Or that you can respond to a demand response situation and really help not only the grid, but your own bills in doing so. So I think part of this becomes producing technologies that are doing the things that we want to do from a policy perspective, but are also so cool that people can't stay away, right? That's how I feel about my electric vehicle, for example. But I think that's the crux of it is we've got to find our ways to objective information sort of out of the political cycle and into the world of innovation as a benefit to quality of life.
Well said. We're going to go, let me go to this gentleman in the back, and then we'll come over here.
I'm Michael Lubell. I'm a professor of physics at CCNY. And you mentioned the 1970s. I taught one of the very first energy policy courses at Yale University at the time. A lot has changed, but there are a few things that are consistent. And I use the word consistent. Consistency in policy in the energy sector was very important back then. It is today. Technological vision was important back then. It is today. We used to focus on the national scene, federal government. That has fallen apart in a large way. You, in New York State, obviously a leader. You mentioned very briefly regional approaches. Can you elaborate on that? Because we have I live in Connecticut, and what goes on in New York affects Connecticut. What goes on in Connecticut will affect New York. What is the regional approach to all of this, since we obviously see some fracturing on the federal level?
Yeah, great question. We've, as I mentioned, we're very familiar with working with other, particularly the New England states and New Jersey in particular, around various aspects of energy policy. And it helps, right? It helps to have that consistency. And it is true, right? It's I'd say it makes my job easier that New York is relatively consistent in our own policy so as to set a standard for others as well. There's a lot of similarities, right? We're all pushing toward electrification, toward clean energy, toward emissions reduction, et cetera. The question just becomes sort of what the pace and scale is of that ambition. And as I said earlier, I would say this is an area that has really improved even over the past few years, both in the ways in which we're seeing, right, the benefits of scale helping each of us, but also the ways in which we're responding to the challenges that we face today. So yes, I have my energy commissioner group chat with Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Jersey and et cetera. Like, there's not that many differences, and we really do benefit from one another.
All right, we're going to get a couple more questions right here, and then we'll go to the back. Julie?
So I'm going to ask two questions, Doreen. I get to talk to you more than the average person in this room probably does. Thinking about what you mentioned with the benefits of solar, for example, and how valuable that was in the hottest days last year. And we're hearing yesterday about, the value that South Fork provided in the coldest days. We heard, I don't know if you were there when LIPA was like, we needed more. We're like, please don't stop spinning, right? How can the state, as leaders, talk to the public about the value that that's providing so that people realize it is sort of one. And related to that is, we know, we've talked about the sort of adjusting / curtailment of the solar program, the distributed solar program, because we met the goal. But we clearly have way more needs, as we just talked about, needing to get to 50 gigawatts. And obviously a lot more of that is going to come in bigger tranches, like we're seeing from utility scale. But that's a direct way that you can save homeowners on their electric bill. So I think, what is the state doing to make sure that we're still providing those supports to keep giving those benefits to consumers at a time when they're thinking about energy more than ever. And I'll just mention that
Yes.
wouldn't it be so awesome if we had a regional program to look at all of our emissions?
You had to, Julie.
All of our emissions
Yeah.
and thinking about a cap and invest program.
Yeah.
Just going to put that out
Just
there.
saying. Just saying.
Been so successful on the energy side.
So on the topic of messaging, I personally am a broken record about all of the metrics that you're just describing, whether it be our small but mighty South Fork project, our distributed solar projects, our storage projects, et cetera. Like, this is where communications really does matter because, of course, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we at NYSERDA at least attempt to be sort of that middle ground, credible resource that people can rely on, and this is something that not only is part of our plans, but actually part of what we do, and I think there's more work to do, but I think we are all better understanding how these resources are actually benefiting consumers in a way that actually has very little to do with climate objectives or clean energy objectives, but everything having to do with, reliability and affordability and all of those things, right? So I think generally people are understanding finally that the world in which we're living, we need to speak in those terms in order to meet consumers where they are. So I think this is a work in progress, but we're seeing the benefits, and I think we're communicating them better than we ever have. With respect to distributed resources, just as was just described, I was very clear when asked the same question at the budget hearing that at least in NYSERDA's view, we do have a need to expand our policy around distributed solar for the very reasons you're describing, not just because we need more generation, but also because this is a very specific resource that has very specific values on a more local level. And therefore, I would like to think 10 gigawatts is not the end of the world here, but I do think, and I'm very clear about this, that I don't think a post-10 gigawatt policy necessarily has to be the same as the pre-10 gigawatt policy. I think we're in a different place. The New York Sun program, which NYSERDA has implemented successfully, in fact, I would say one of our most successful programs over a number of years. It's it's something we're working on to say, like, how can the evolution of utility systems, of rates, of tax policy, of permitting policy, of interconnection policy dovetail into a New York Sun that allows us, right, to meet the moment, but also to realize that it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing that it was. So I'm happy for the pressure on distributed solar. I welcome it because I do think we really need to chart a course to the future for those resources as well.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I saw a hand up in the back. Is that okay? Sure. All right, and maybe we can get both of these in. Can you make this very brief? Thanks, Jeff.
Jeff Perlman from Bright Power. Hi, Doreen. Thank you. Julie sort of alluded to this. Obviously, there's a lot of money that's involved in trying to make all this stuff happen. Cap and Invest was one of the sources of, a big source of funding. What's going on with that? And in the absence of that, what are the other available resources to make all this stuff happen? Financial resources, I'm talking.
You had to make me say it. Yeah. While I cannot comment on pending litigation, sorry, not legislation, litigation, obviously, the work is underway by DEC, but I think most importantly, we recognize, right, in a most general of senses, that when we are thinking about the transformation of our economy, like, I think we're all better understanding, like, what it will really take. And it's going to take something, as I just said to Julie, it's more than a subsidy program on a ratepayer bill, right? We are talking about an economic transition, an economy-wide transition, and sort of funding the very activities that we are looking for consumers to pivot to via electric rates. Like, one could very generally say that is a odd way to go about it, right? And so we recognize that it's all of these policies, whether it be tax policy, but also policies like those that we have implemented that really need to be transformed across our economy. So for what it's worth, take a look at the State Energy Plan. We talk about economy-wide solutions as really part of this transition.
Great. And the final question here.
Eon Simonides with 9 Energy. I had a question similar to Julie's question about distributed solar, but about distributed front-of-the-meter connected battery storage. And the section in the energy plan on accelerating the deployment of clean energy resources notably doesn't include front-of-the-meter distribution-connected battery storage. And I think that that's a problem because transmission scale storage is great. It's big and it's beautiful, and we love those big projects. But a lot of the issues with the grid are hyper-localized, especially downstate. And so I think the question that I have is around what NYSERDA is doing going forward, because our SIP addresses a lot of hard costs, and those are dropping, but soft costs are not. And so I'm curious to ask Doreen, what is NYSERDA doing going forward, especially because the 6 gigawatt storage goal might be one of the only short-term goals that we might actually be able to achieve, but we have a long way to get there. We're only at 0.5 gigawatt right now. So thank you.
Sure. We do have, I maybe will need to talk to you afterward because obviously I might not quite understand your question, but we have, within the 6 gigawatt goal, right, we have programs that are around retail, residential, and bulk deployment. Is your question more like after 6 gigawatts, what might we be looking toward? Well, I don't remember the point from the plan, but a lot of the plan lays out, right, the sort of 2040 vision. Our job is to deliver on that. So to the extent that the plan is referring to energy storage in the future, I want you to understand that we wouldn't claim that we don't need all three of those types of resources to get from here to there for the very reasons you're describing. But in some instances, for example, with solar, I think we used a term, I forget what term we used with solar, and suddenly everyone was up in arms because they misinterpreted the term that we were using. My point is, we're setting a broader frame, and within that frame, we really need to lay out the policies and the sort of sub-targets within that. And you're absolutely right. The biggest challenge we have with storage is siting, full stop, and the standardization thereof. So that is, work underway, as with anything, and I'll just conclude by saying, there is one, I suppose, silver lining about the challenges that we're facing from the energy system perspective, which is that we're going to have a number of years here where we have an increasing number of renewable and energy storage technologies and clean energy technologies actually operating across our state. And we are excited to demonstrate just what they are doing, right? Even if we see headwinds that are going to exist for the next couple of years, we're going to have operating projects that we can learn from, that we can grow from, and that we can build from, all the way from your retail storage project all the way to the offshore wind projects and beyond. It is our job to demonstrate the impacts that these projects are having and to minimize, right, the sort of issues that would ensue. We need to be ready. I keep saying we need to be ready and keep these industries moving, but also the consumer education that can be part of that, I think, is going to be a very important part of how we get from here to there. So let's demonstrate, right? Let's demonstrate so that we can build when the time comes. Thank you.
Terrific.